Greetings and welcome to what I hope will be a new and productive series. This is not a MGTOW Talks. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because there's been some interest in talking about other countries. I'd mentioned that, say, in the MGTOW sense. But increasingly, there's so much going on in the world politically with many different countries and so many different perspectives. And I thought it would be interesting to put together a series where I talk to and interview people from basically around the globe. Now, probably there will be a focus on Europe more than others, just because Europeans seem to be more accessible, and I live in Europe and what have you. But I hope this will be interesting. Now, one thing I'm going to say, we're not hopefully going to be talking too much about MGTOW and whatever. My guest today is Golden Eagle Owl. He is a man going his own way, but that's not going to be the focus of the talk. He is our expert on Portugal. He is Portuguese, and we're going to be talking about the history and the culture and the food possibly as well. I'm going to talk about salted cod for an hour and a half. I think the idea is to give people more insight into different countries, different cultures, the history. And some are going to be more, I guess, exotic than others. In the case of Portugal, I would imagine particularly North Americans aren't terribly familiar with it. So the way we're going to be talking about these things is more from an introductory perspective. I'm not an expert on Portugal. I've only been there twice in my life, but I do know some of the history, and I think there's just a lot of ground to cover. And the other thing I think it's important to do is sort of look at this from an interconnected perspective. So we talk about Portugal, but what are, say, the difference between Portugal and the United States or Germany and so on and so forth. So with all of that said, the title of the series is Perspectives, and of course we're covering Portugal. So thank you very much for being here today, expert on Portugal, Golden Eagle Owl, who has his own channel, link in the low bar. So the very first thing we should probably start with is, where the hell is Portugal?
Oh, hello there, Stargus. Hello, everyone. Well, for those of you who would probably be unaware, Portugal was in southern Europe, so what really bugs me and bugs a lot of other Portuguese is that a lot of times people mistake Portugal as being part of Spain, and that's probably the most grievous insult you could ever tell a Portuguese.
Right, so to be specific, Portugal is in southern Europe, and it's on the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula.
It's the westernmost country in Europe.
And when people confuse it with Spain, in some sense they can be forgiven because it's literally nestled in. It's surrounded by Spain.
Well, yes.
You have the Atlantic on the left and Spain on the north south.
There are
right.
only neighbors.
Yeah, pretty much. But obviously the confusion. Understood.
There's a lot of historical connections between the two nations. So. During a certain time, Portugal was Spain, so.
And we'll get into that. So for the first thing is, so it's a southern European country nestled in between the Atlantic Ocean and Spain. Tends not to be as much in the spotlight as Spain because it's smaller and I guess less known.
And that's actually a good thing, in my opinion. Being away from the spotlight.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I live in a spotlight country, so I would agree. Now, another thing that we probably should mention is that, on paper, Portuguese and Spanish look very similar as languages, and of course they're very closely related. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. But if you ever listen to the difference between the way Portuguese and Spanish are pronounced, they're quite different. So Portuguese is a distinct language. It has a distinct sound, to some, and in many cases, a distinct grammar. Spanish and Portuguese are not identical. But obviously people might conflate the two. But with all that said, so we have the geography. So let's just start with the history. So Portugal, obviously, originally, we can't go too far back, but it was part of the Roman Empire.
Yes, it was. By the time it was the region was known as Lusitania, and Lusitania wasn't really. The borders of Lusitania did not match, the current borders of Portugal. Lusitania was basically split between modern southern Portugal and a sizable chunk of Spain. So, in a sense, we kind of, as Portuguese, we kind of adopted that moniker as the Lusitanians. So, I mean, if we're going to look to people, a certain tribe, before the existence of the Kingdom of Portugal, I mean that would have been the Lusitanians. That would have been our closest ancestors.
Right, but of course,
and even in Lusitania, I mean, it was not a single tribe. I mean, it was divided in I don't know, like over I think safely over 24 different tribes with each with their own borders and.
Right.
So,
and if I recall right, Portugal or Hispania, which was the term for the entirety of that area, I believe it was incorporated into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century BC, and was basically there until more or less the fall. Then there was an invasion by the Visigoths, Germanic tribes, and they were there for a few centuries.
Yes, the Visigoths were basically the sort of like the cultural descendants of the Romans in the sense that they perpetuated Christianity after the fall of the empire.
And then in the 8th century, there's a big transition, of course, because as many of you know, by then the great religion of Islam was underway throughout the world, particularly in northern Africa and the Middle East. And what later became known as the Moors, they, I believe it was in the 8th century, set foot in Hispania, and they dramatically changed the landscape politically, religiously for centuries. So, I mean, to the extent that you're aware of it and know about it, let's talk about the Moors and the Muslim influence in Portugal.
Well, it was a bit of an onslaught at the start. I mean, the local kings, basically at the time they were the Visigoth kings. I mean, they were not prepared for such an organized invasion, in the sense that what happens is that the Islamic forces took most of the peninsula, except for a tiny stretch of land in the north of the peninsula, in the Asturian mountains. And what followed was basically a process, a slow process of reconquest, of the Reconquista, from the north, from more organized Christian kings back to the south, and that's what formed, the kingdoms of at the time it was the Kingdom of Leon, the Kingdom of Castilla, the Kingdom of Navarra.
And I think this is an important point, because usually, at least in the context of Spain, when we talk about, I'll just use the Spanish word, the Reconquista, there's a sort of very fixed date, 1492. But the reality is that, as far as I can recall, there was a reconquest really going back to the 11th or 12th century. It was ongoing, continuous.
It took possibly like 6 centuries to complete.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea that there's this one, 1492, and boom,
no,
everything is.
It took a lot of time. It took a lot of time, and in fact, there were. I mean, it was a very complicated time, because you had countries basically forming. There was separatist movements. In case Portugal, that would be a good example of a separatist nation, because we were part of the. At the time, it was the joint kingdom of Leon and Castilla, and at the time we were a county. Ruled by Henrique, that would be Henry, the father of what would become the first king, Afonso Henriques. And
that's Alfonso in English for you guys who don't understand that.
Yes,
anyway.
Yes. there was a lot of instability even among the Christian kingdoms. That there was a lot of squabbling amongst each other. At the same time, they were fighting the Muslims. So there was that sort of like divine task, of sort of like commanded by Rome, of like ridding the territory of the Moors. But basically, it was that, but it also was a lot of it was about getting territories. It wasn't strictly like a holy war.
No, obviously not.
It was very there were practical goals to be achieved.
Now, if you depicted sort of the Visigothic rule as essentially just effectively a continuation, at least, of Roman principles. I mean, the Visigoths were Germanic,
yes.
Germanic peoples, but
by then they were incorporated into the empire.
Yeah, right. But
were citizens.
Obviously, things changed a great deal when the Moors came in. What do you think, to any extent, if you were to say there's some degree of influence? I mean, do you think there has been any lasting influence of Moorish rule with respects to Portugal, say into the modern day? Obviously, centuries ago. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
I'd say so. And one of the places to look for is the language. For instance, the name of our southernmost region, Algarve. It's that was the Arabic name. It was Algarve. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly what it meant.
Right. Well, no, and it's true of Spanish as well. There are a lot of.
But in the language, yes, that's the place to look for.
Imported from Arabic, and so I'd imagine that I'm more familiar with Spanish than I am with Portuguese. If they're obviously probably were words imported from Arabic, but beyond the language, do you think there was any sort of lasting influence, or did the sort of Reconquista and the Catholic influence just completely eliminate all of that?
I'd pretty much say that it was mostly language that remains.
Right. Now, if we over those centuries, if we move forward to like the official date, so in 1492 in Spain during the Reconquista, obviously, basically all the territories in the Iberian Peninsula had more or less, to my knowledge, been reconquered. There were mass expulsions of Jews and Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did the same thing, to my knowledge, happened in Portugal, as far as I know?
Well, there was, but at the same time, there were still Muslims and Jews that remained, in Portugal and Spain. They lived in. At the time, they had, sort of segregated quarters of the city for them. In Portuguese, that would be the judirias, so that would be the Jewish quarters. And in Lisbon, there is one of the quarters is called Moraria, so that would be the Moorish equivalent of the Juderia.
Okay.
So they were, they were not completely expelled, from the country.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, things were just harsher on them because they weren't Christian.
Right. Well, I mean, so I guess I'm hardly an expert on Portugal in this regard, but as far as I know, in terms of the Spanish Reconquista, it was basically convert or die.
Well, yes,
or leave.
Yes,
could leave as well.
It's more like convert or pay an extra tax because you're not Christian. It's probably more like that. I mean, if there was a benefit to be gained from, even if that was something like an extra tax, I mean, they would allow a portion of like Muslims and Jews to remain in Portugal. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't all out Christian. I mean, at one point in history, when the inquisitional movements really gained a lot of traction, that was probably the worst time, because they were forced to either convert, so they would become what we call
out of the faith. How do you say it?
Novos cristãos. Yeah, yes, the out of the faith. That would be the name of the trials. In English that would be an act of faith.
Yeah.
So where basically they would try them to test their faith, to test if they were true Christians. And what happened is a lot of the Jewish population was basically forced to hide themselves, to disguise themselves as Christians. So they adopted Christian last names to hide their heritage. Those that could flee somewhere else and had the possibility to flee, they did that. But a lot of them just really had no chance to run, so they had to basically hide themselves. They had to hide their true faith. Yeah.
All right. Now, around the same time is when Portugal begins to really make a mark on the world, because, the final period of time of the Reconquista, briefly after that, you get the beginnings of basically the Portuguese Empire, and there were some very famous explorers that were Portuguese.
Yes, there was the Portuguese expansion. I'd say the first step of our expansion was to the territories that are now called the Azores and Madeira. So they're the two archipelagos that belong to Portugal. They're in the middle of the Atlantic. But the first step of Portugal's expansion to Africa and to other places began in Northern Africa with the conquest of Ceuta. So at the time it was sort of a blend between, I wouldn't say maybe completely a holy war or a new crusade. It was that, but also it served the purpose to gain a foothold in what was at the time the Silk Route. So the Portuguese decided to move to Northern Africa. That would be today's Morocco. To gain just really a foothold so that they could launch their expansion, because at the time they were competing basically with other city-states, other countries that were very rich. There's the city-state of Venice. It was incredibly rich because most of the trade routes to India, where all the valuable spices were, passed through them. So, that made Venice incredibly wealthy, along with other Italian city-states. And Portugal basically decided to seek an alternative, a faster way to reach to the east, to India. So they decided to check if there was a path, through the ocean that could get them there fast enough, and so that they could move a lot of a sizable, a bigger portion of goods, of spice, of basically anything. And that's how it started. We basically launched ships after ships to colonize, to gain important footholds in the African west coast.
Or you sailed around the entire continent.
Yes, exactly. Because the main route, which was into Europe, passed through Turkey, like modern day Turkey. In that sense, the Ottoman Empire was also incredibly wealthy. Because a lot of the trade, most of the trade to the east passed through there. So basically, Portugal was sort of trying to break a monopoly.
Right.
That was the motivation.
Now, that the original motivation, but at some point in time, Portugal became a major colonial power.
Yes.
And I mean, the fact that we have countries such as Brazil
Yes.
and to a lesser extent countries such as Angola and Mozambique, I mean, that testifies to that. How much are you aware of Portuguese involvement in South America, for example?
Well, it started with the. I'm not sure if you are a lot of people in the audience would know about, but there was sort of a famous treaty between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Castilla. It was called. By the way, the Kingdom of Castilla, to those of you that don't know, would be the Kingdom of Spain. That was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And basically that was like a deal between two nations to split the entire world in half. It was a treaty sanctioned by the Pope, where those two nations basically drew a line in the charts and basically said, okay, from this line, to the east, everything to the east of this line belongs to Portugal. Everything to the west of this line belongs to Spain. And there was a curious thing, when the treaty was being signed, is that at the time the Portuguese king decided to move the line westwards by, I don't know how much was it, like slightly over 100 miles or something. Maybe I'm mistaking, the number, but it moved the line westward a bit. And that was just enough to place the line in what would be today's Brazil territory in South America. So, I mean, there's the theory that before Brazil was officially discovered in the year 1500, that there was already knowledge that existed land in that part of the world. So.
Right. Now, so after that occurred, obviously Portugal was involved in colonizing at least that part of South America. Now, we know, at least in the case of Spain, obviously there were some mercantile interests in terms of things like gold
Yes.
and other resources, but it would seem to always be
Not
sort of mixed together with issues of faith, converting the pagans
Yes.
and what have you.
It was not that different in the Portuguese case. I suppose the only difference would be the scale of our enterprise.
Right.
There was also of course the goal to convert as many as possible to Christianity. So there were a lot of missionaries sent, but economic interest was a lot bigger. I mean, they were more focused about getting Brazilian gold or investing in sugar and coffee plantations in Brazil, and that generated a tremendous amount of income.
And I imagine it was a similar situation with the African colonies in Mozambique.
Yeah, and there was a lot of. They used the slave trade, from Africa to provide working force to South America.
Right. Yeah. So now, how long? I mean, roughly speaking, would you say when did the Portuguese Empire reach its apex, and when did it start to decline in your estimation?
I mean, the apex would have been, in the 16th century, and the decline is very easy to be marked. It was with the death of the king Sebastião. So that would be Dom Sebastião I, the Sebastian I, and he was
what century or what year approximately was that?
I mean, the problem is that led to like a succession crisis. That the King of Spain took huge advantage. So I mean, he, if I remember correctly, it was I think 1578 that Sebastian. I mean, he planned to launch like a sort of a new crusade, in North Africa, and it was in the Battle of Alcácer Quibir where he fell. Basically, no one never found his body, but everyone assumes that he was either kidnapped or killed on the spot. But everyone assumed basically that he died, and that opened the door to the Spanish king at the time. It was Philip II of Spain or Castilla. That would then become Philip I of Portugal, and it was the first of three Philips, three Spanish kings that ruled Portugal. So at the time, the two kingdoms were combined, and that was coincidentally the time of the great apex of Spain, of the Spanish Empire.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could argue that the continuity of Spanish colonial power was greater, or it lasted longer than the Portuguese. Now, of course, there were, fast forwarding a bit, just as Spain and England and France eventually had to cede its power to the locals and give up on their colonial lands. In the case of Brazil, for example,
the case of Brazil is a different one because that was tied into the Portuguese Civil War.
Right.
So at the time it was the king. No, wait. That was during the Napoleonic invasion. The entire court, the king, the princes, pretty much all the high nobility fled from Portugal, and basically left the people to their own fortune. So they fled to Brazil. In there, the son of the king, Pedro, who would later become Pedro IV of Portugal, he declared an independence, the independence of Brazil. He declared himself as the first king and the first emperor of Brazil, sort of as an autonomous nation. That was before he was king of Portugal, because at the time, his brother Miguel was claiming the Portuguese throne, and the whole thing led to the civil war that opposed the side of Dom Miguel, which was the side of the absolutist monarchy. So that would be like the monarchy, like Louis XV of France, like an absolute where the king is the entire power, all that stuff. And Pedro was.
But during this time, at the same time, if I might ask a question, was there any sense of sort of growing opposition to the crown or absolute monarchy? Because when we look at France, which I'm much more familiar with, it really was the absolutism of the monarchs that led to a sort of public frustration, and eventually it led to the destruction of the at least the absolutist aspect of the monarchy. Did you have anything resembling that in Portugal?
It wasn't so much a popular uprising. It was more opposition from, as I was going to say, the brother of Miguel, Pedro, which was a liberal monarch. So it was in favor of a parliamentary monarchy. And the fact that there isn't a lot of probably the case of France is rather unique in the popular uprising against an absolute monarch. I think there were a lot more countries that did a smoother transition from an absolutist monarch to a parliamentary one. To there's the case of even Spain, for instance.
Yeah. Now, of course, Brazil was a different story, but at some point in time, we move forward, and we're moving forward quite a bit. But probably the most important period in modern Portuguese history is, I guess, to talk about the government, the Estado Novo by Salazar. Yes. For those who don't know, for a big chunk of Portuguese 20th century history, about 40 years, I think.
41.
there was a 41.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there you go. I think 74 it ended. Portugal was dominated by a fascist, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that was a huge legacy. The first time I visited Portugal, I think it was '86, and there were still very much these undertones. I guess the legacy I can still, if I can remember right, of Salazar. So, why don't we talk about Salazar a little bit? What he did, how people perceived him, what kind of government he had, and really also the relationship of Salazar's government to the rest of the world. I mean, certainly the relationship of. Do you know anything about Salazar's versus the National Socialists in Germany, for example?
Actually, it was not close to the National Socialist movement. In his opinion, he despised socialism, and he despised socialism, and what would be the National Socialist movement. I mean, it was no exception. I mean, to the extent that Portugal did not take part in the Second World War. And it kept itself apart. I mean, it did deals. I mean, they dealt with. They sold wolfram to Nazi Germany, but then again, they also made deals with the Allies. So
would you say that overall, particularly during the period of, say, World War II, that Portugal, because I'll be honest, I don't know that much about Portuguese involvement in World War II, was more or less a kind of a neutral player?
It was Portugal, was neutral by then, and that's probably like one of the few things that people actually cherish about Salazar is that he kept Portugal out of the Second World War.
Right, but now you're saying though, I think most people refer to Salazar's government as fascist, but if you're saying that he despised socialism, now in very common parlance, I mean, fascism often is just associated with socialism. So when if you talk about these, in modern European politics, they're called far right parties. They're really just all they are just basically populist xenophobes who like socialist policies, socialist economic policies. What about Salazar's policies that sort of distinguished him from, I guess, more conventional fascism as people understand it?
It wasn't that. It wasn't like a socialist like other fascist movements. It was more conservative. Basically, it was a very from what I know, it was a very conservative government. So very traditionalistic. Very tied to Catholicism.
So I imagine the Pope probably supported him in large measure.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. Actually, I don't.
That's fair enough.
I don't have that sort of information, but there was.
Well, I mean, by support, I don't mean he was saying.
But church and state were close, were really tied together.
Now, but was that a facade? I mean, was it? I mean, because a lot of leaders over the centuries have used religion as a kind of symbolic facade to justify their power. Or was he? Would you say that Salazar was legitimately religious and pious?
No, he was. He was super traditionalist. Like really old school religion. I mean, one of his mottos, one of the mottos of the Estado Novo government. Was Familia Patria Deus, which is family, homeland, God. Yeah, was basically the sacred the trinity of the Salazar regime.
But of course, there are people reading about this that absolutely hated him. I imagine.
Yes. And there's a lot more reasons to hate Salazar than to love him.
So would you say his legacy, or even when he was in power, that popular support for him was pretty minimal?
But then again, you have to consider that people just couldn't express themselves freely. There was a.
So if someone said something, just hypothetically, wrote an article in a newspaper that he didn't prison them.
No, the article wouldn't even be published.
Well, what about, but certainly if someone attempted that, they would be, what, in prison?
Like an underground,
executed?
like an underground newspaper or something. Yeah, there was probably that, like at the time it was the communist, the communist influenced and socialist
Right. Now,
influenced
another question I
newspapers.
have in exploring Salazar, and I don't mean to be jumping all over, is that
Okay.
so during this period, the United States was very much a player, and so this isn't not necessarily the case of Portugal. I don't know enough about it, but in the efforts to combat communism worldwide, the United States, as we say, threw in its lot with a lot of shady people and supported a lot of unpleasant people, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and so on and so forth. What was the relationship? I mean, I would imagine the United States supported to some degree Salazar because, well, he kept the commies out, basically.
Yeah, I don't think there's there isn't a lot of information yet, regarding that, but it's complicated because in theory, yes, they probably would support Salazar because he was against communism, because he just hated socialism and communism. But in the same token, they did undermine, some of Portugal's interests. For instance, in Africa, the United States were a part of, breaking colonialism in Africa. Yeah,
and we should talk about that as well, because when Salazar died...
Can I just add another thing?
Sure.
The thing is, during Salazar's regime, I'd say the contact with other nations was pretty minimal. I mean, Portugal was it had a very isolationist attitude. It was proudly alone. In Portugal, that would be orgulhosamente sós. That was like another of the mottos. And basically, what Salazar had in mind was like a revival of the old Portuguese colonial empire. And I mean, so to that extent, we were pretty isolated, because like the entire the rest of Europe was shedding their colonies, but Portugal was
what was his relationship to Franco Spain? I mean,
they were
obviously
they were friendly.
When you listen to the stories about what Franco had done to Spain, I mean, it sounds horrible. Was there anything comparable in Portugal?
I mean, the only thing is, like, maybe it wasn't so overt, but I mean, there was a lot of repression, obviously. I mean, besides the censorship, like anyone that had an opinion against the government would be arrested by the police, by the political police, by the PIDE. So they were locked away, tortured. I mean, it was just there was really an aura of fear floating in the country.
Fun times for all.
Yeah.
Now, when he dies, there's a vacuum, and obviously, what I can think of, and we were talking about this before we started, look at the African colonies. Now, both Mozambique and Angola were struck by massive civil wars. In the case of Angola, it went on for over 25 years. So, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with it. I'm somewhat familiar, but obviously, let's talk about Angola, for example, which probably has, by the way, no, it's actually, Mozambique has the best flag in the world. It has an AK-47. In the case of Angola, Angola, I know.
On it.
Oh, yeah, there you go. It's I mean, machete, AK-47, what's better than that? Angola, of course, is a resource-rich country. It's got gold, it's got other stuff, a lot to fight over. And the Civil War, as I said, lasted from the 70s into, I think, 2002 is when it ended.
Don't remember exactly, but yeah.
I think that's when it ended. I know it went up for over 25 years. And, of course, it was kind of fitted under the image of, communism versus, capitalism.
Yes. Because basically, the two factions in conflict, the MPLA and the UNITA, were basically backed by different players. Like, one was backed by the Soviet Union, one was backed by the United States and the CIA. There were some shitty covert ops in there.
Incidentally, is absolutely fascinating, because you have these countries where you have both the Soviet Union and the United States getting involved, really where there's, okay, some of these countries have resources, but really just purely on political and ideological grounds. I mean, countries that just don't really do a lot for either United States or the USSR, but because there's ideological battle going on, they get involved anyway. Yeah.
Well, but in the case of Angola, you really have to question how deep was that, what was the extent of the ideology in the struggle? Was it about ideology? Was it about getting access to those resources? I mean,
probably in the case of Angola it was both. I think a lot of these African countries' cases, it was a combination of both. You might say that I guess the ideology is kind of like a cover, a surface, superficial thing.
It's a way to sell war to the people, basically.
Yeah. Now, Portugal obviously was involved to some degree in these wars. Now, eventually, I mean, if we fast forward, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about all this history because people aren't familiar with all this, but I mean, what is the relationship? So the civil wars are over. We're kind of moving to the modern period, or approximately where we are now. What is the relationship of the old colonies, such as Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, to modern Portugal?
It's a friendly relationship. I'd say possibly with Angola, it's a bit more complicated because, basically they have a president that's like a dictator. I mean, it's just not a dictator is a dictator in anything but name. And basically, I mean, the Portuguese government really tries to avoid, calling him out on like human rights violations, on the fact that he ignores or that he manipulates elections.
You're talking about, was it Eduardo
José Eduardo Santos.
Yeah, I obviously I can't pronounce it right, but yeah.
So I mean, the reason for that is that Portugal and Angola right now are extremely connected, business wise. His daughter, the daughter of the Angolan president, is quite possibly the richest woman in Africa, and she is a major player in a lot of Portuguese companies. For instance, a communications company, and I mean the Angolan government has a stake in some media outlets of Portugal. Basically, the Angola is basically like not like exactly an oligarchy, but where everything's kept inside the family, so it's like a dynasty, So you have one family just commanding the entire country. They have the elite, basically. I mean, they have this tremendous wealth of resources, and the ruling elite just gets it all. And
so there's ongoing connections between Portugal and the case of Angola, but in general between the former
basically we can. There was a moment, especially like during the worst years of our crisis, of our economic crisis, where Angola was buying a lot of Portuguese debt, so they were becoming like shareholders of the country. So to the point where we kind of joked around saying, it's like Angola can buy, the Avenida da Liberdade. It's like the main avenue of Lisbon, is where they have all the posh clothing stores where the Angolans come to buy clothes or whatever.
Now, obviously these days, I guess the image of Brazil eclipses the image of Portugal. And when people think of, I don't speak Portuguese, but I'm familiar with the sounds, and obviously Brazilian Portuguese sounds radically different from, and I think when people think of Portuguese, they instantly think of actually Brazil, not really Portugal. Does that give Portugal a kind of ego complex at all, or you guys just don't really care about that?
Yeah, no, it kind of does, it kind of does, because it's like seeing your kids outperform you.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. but yeah, like regarding language, Brazilian Portuguese is it's different. It's a lot more fluid, and the sounds are more open, so to speak. And actually, foreigners that decide to learn Portuguese, they say that it's a lot easier to learn the Brazilian version because they understand the syllables a lot better than the the Portuguese version of Portugal of Portuguese.
Yeah. Now, if we just completely fast forward to, say, modern Portugal, one of the things that I think many people internationally had heard about was apparently had a big impact, or you probably could tell me more about the impact, was the decriminalization of all drugs in Portugal.
It was about that. Like, I just have to clear it out. It's not like, it's not like it's Amsterdam over here, and you can just
Well, one thing I was
like
there
crazy.
in the early 2000s. There were always lots of drug dealers. As a tourist, I was just kind of walking around, and they're always offering me drugs.
No, but I suppose like that's everywhere. It's
I have to disagree. I've been to many different cities, particularly in Europe, and I don't remember the degree of sort of drug offers. Just people walking up and like, "You want this?" I felt it was kind of more a unique thing in Lisbon. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I'd say that you probably you got the wrong impression.
Fair enough.
But
fair enough.
As I was saying, the only thing that was decriminalized was the consumption of drugs. So I think basically there's like a chart where it's specified, the amounts of a certain type of drug that you can carry to be considered, something for personal consumption, because otherwise it would be considered trafficking. And I suppose the main reason behind that law was to provide, to be able to provide, better assistance to those that were seeking treatment for drug addiction, so that to remove a bit the stigma and the blame from those people, because possibly many wouldn't go to a clinic, to say that they wanted treatment to get off the addiction of, say, heroin. If it was
what would you say then the most important impact of these reforms has been? Is there less criminal activity related to drugs, would you say?
No, there's a lot of drug trade. Obviously, because Portugal is one of the gateways of, for instance, Europe. South American drugs to Europe.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think the positive effect is that there was really a reduction of cases of really addicts, of drug addicts, especially of hard drugs like heroin and cocaine. But heroin was a bigger deal. I think was in the 80s, 90s. It was really a huge problem in Portugal, in that in Lisbon especially. There were slums that were basically hotspots for selling heroin, and the whole thing just kind of got, I don't know if it got really reduced or if it was just swept under a rug. But it's not the problem that it was 20, 25 years ago.
Well, that's certainly good.
Yeah.
Now, one of the big questions is, Portugal's been officially part of the European Union for a long time. It adopted the currency when it was put on the market in 2000. So, there's a lot to talk about with that. But what do you think the relationship of? Do you think European Union participation has been beneficial to Portugal, or more of a negative thing?
Well, I'd say. This is a bit of a point of contention.
Now, you're young.
Yeah.
You really remember the time before direct involvement in the EU.
Well, no, because I was born after Portugal entered the.
You must remember before the Euro.
I know the stories. I know what I've heard, but I'd say that for the most part, it has been positive because Portugal wasn't really a strong economy. I mean, since it spent so like 4 decades isolated from the rest of the world, it had after that had that decades of just excess where it was just filled like socialist government after socialist government was excess that led to the first first bailout in the I think 86. I may be mistaken about this, but I'd say overall the our presence inside the European Union has been positive. I mean, I'd say the living standards have increased in that time. For sure.
Well, I think this is,
even today with the crisis and with a lot of people and with the struggling economy, it's still better than before the European Union.
Right, but if we talk about the crisis, I mean, I was mentioning before, you have not been overwhelmed by hordes of third world refugees in Portugal the way some other countries like Germany have been. But last year the big topic of conversation in spring and summer were particularly Greece, but just the economic incompatibility essentially of the southern European countries such as Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal. And I mean that's still ongoing.
Yes, absolutely. That did not end. I mean, the situation in Greece is a lot worse than what we have in Portugal. That's for sure. I mean, but
you still have relatively high unemployment.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I think it was 15% unemployment in Spain,
which is bad, not compared to Greece.
In Spain, it got to like 20% unemployment or something.
Yeah, Greece, it's off the charts. I mean, last time I checked, it literally was close to 50% in some cases for young men.
Yeah.
And I imagine things politically
there's a lot of sort of resentment against Germany because we felt that we were being exploited, because of the interest rates. Because basically the way we see it, Germany is making a tremendous amount of money just with interest from the.
Well, the ECB is based in Germany, obviously.
So there's that. We felt that between states that in the European Union there should be a bit more cooperation. So we would probably expect, okay, we have a debt and we'll pay the debt. We'll pay everything that we borrowed, but with reasonable interest. I mean, we're all in the same boat here. We all want the European Union to thrive.
So you're economic. Would you say? Well, that's an important question. The two aspects. Now, number one, would you say as a nation Portugal supports the European Union, and you personally as an individual, you support the perpetuation of the European Union?
That's the thing. Here in Portugal, it's. There's a bit of people are a bit split on that topic. Some people think that it's a lot that'd be better to just leave the European Union to go back to our former currency, to basically, to step down a couple of levels, from economic quality, so that we can have something that's sustainable. And like in a sense, they're right, but I personally think that there's more benefits in remaining in the European Union. I think there's just needs to be like a change in politics from in the wealthiest nations of the European Union, especially Germany. I think Germany needs to be a bit less greedy about
of course,
charge in interest rates and all that.
I wasn't aware of the degree of resentment towards the Germans.
Now, when Angela Merkel visited Portugal, was last year or I don't know, 2 years ago, possibly last year. I mean, they expected huge protests against her, and there were some protests next to whatever venues she went to. So she only stayed. I don't think she even stayed a full day in Portugal.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I think a lot of, I'm not German, but I mean, a lot of people in Germany and I guess Northern European countries feel that the inclusion of Southern Europe into at least the European Union economy or the Eurozone was a mistake.
Yeah.
And certainly you can see that argument in the case of Greece. Yeah. None of these countries were as economically robust as some of the more northern countries, and it's sort of so essentially that part of is artificial in some sense, because the idea of having a joint currency across a whole bunch of countries that have just very different. For example, I mean, I'm almost certain, I don't know what the stats are, that your fishing industry is a lot bigger than, say, Germany's fishing industry. So you just have a lot of.
But then again, it was the fishing industry, for instance, was dramatically reduced because of the whole European Union system of quotas. So basically, we can fish so much, we had to reduce a lot. So that created a.
So now we're coming sort of to the topic of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, I've been critical of this for years, and in general critical of the power of Brussels. And I've always been a bit of a Eurosceptic, and now I'm just I just think the whole thing should be dissolved, to be honest. But how much influence does Brussels have over Portugal? Because in the case of when people were voting on the European Constitution, some countries like the Netherlands or Ireland voted against it, and they kept on pushing and it didn't matter. So they voted no, but say, "Oh, we'll do it again." Yeah. They vote no, and then they finally say, "It doesn't matter. You're part of it."
There is that feeling over here that we're basically powerless against whatever decisions.
But don't you think it would be better to just go back to Portugal being separate? And
I'd say for that. Probably would be better for a complete for the European Union to dissolve completely instead of just kicking out one or two.
No, I'm not suggesting. Absolutely, I'm not suggesting selectively kicking out the countries. I think you need a complete dissolution. I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
Now, regarding refugees, I mean, obviously the demographics are very different in Portugal. You're not getting hordes of, say, North Africans. No. On average, and also I think you've mentioned that the Muslim population is pretty small in Portugal.
Yeah, it's pretty small. I mean, culturally, there's the whole cultural reason. I mean, historically, it hasn't been really favorable for a big.
Portugal remains very Catholic, I understand.
Yeah, and part of that's still due to the Estado Novo, to Salazar's regime, because church was so connected with state, and I mean that's kind of like the legacy of the Estado Novo, is that the society nowadays is still, I mean, it's getting more in touch with what goes on in the rest of Europe and the United States, but it's still very conservative. Like the older people, the older generations are still quite conservative, quite traditionalist. Yeah.
So you'd say that there's a fairly hostile environment towards Muslims?
No, I wouldn't say hostile. No, definitely not the word. Because the Portuguese are actually very open to people. I mean, we kind of pride ourselves of treating outsiders really well, and
but okay, maybe hostile is the wrong word. So, for example, in Germany and the UK, there are actually sort of Sharia courts that are
but we don't have that here, because
and I imagine you wouldn't tolerate that either.
Possibly not. But then again, it's hard to tell if we would tolerate or not, because we just don't have the numbers we just don't have such an extensive Muslim population as France has, or Germany, or the UK have.
But that's part of the cultural and historical legacy, being very Catholic.
And economically speaking, because Portugal is not really an attractive place for, if
you don't have the great welfare.
Yeah, and if you're looking for, like if you're leaving your home country in search and head to Europe in search of a better life, I mean, you're probably going to think about going to Germany or Sweden or something. You're
absolutely.
not going to think about coming to Portugal. I mean, consider the, every time.
Well, yeah, I read a story about an immigrant in a paper today, and he crossed from Syria through Turkey, Slovenia, Hungary. He was trying to get to Germany. He didn't want to stop in those other countries.
And like every time you ask them, they say, "Oh, I want to go to Germany. I want to go to Denmark or Sweden or something." There's even like I don't know if this is true, if it's like an internet rumor, but basically we were assigned like some 4,000 refugees, by the quota system imposed by Brussels.
Yeah.
But I think I don't know if this is a rumor or not, but I think they interviewed like some of those refugees and they expressed, a certain disappointment because they were coming to Portugal and they weren't going to Germany.
Yeah.
They were not going to the
well, actually, there's not just that. Even in these wealthier countries like Germany, some of the expectations that I don't even know to call them refugees. I'll call them refugees, whatever. I've seen video footage of they complain that the food isn't good enough or the size of the meals is not good enough. It's not frequent enough, or the accommodations, where they're sleeping, it's not big enough. And I mean, they really, some of them, not all of them, but some of them really expect to just, come here, I'm just going to get everything I want with a snap of a finger. I can imagine it could be that much worse in Portugal because you're not a wealthy country and you can't offer them all things.
We cannot even support our own welfare. It's not even.
No, there's another thing we didn't talk about though, and I picked up on this a couple of years ago, and maybe you can tell. There was a kind of an exodus of I guess it was Russians or was it Ukrainians who went to Portugal, right?
Yeah, there was. It was about 10 years ago or something. There was.
Were they Ukrainian or Russian?
Both. I mean, there was Ukrainian. I think most of them were Ukrainian. Some Moldovans and Russians, and they. I mean, you could say that their adaptation to Portugal was like a success story because, I mean, it was just mind-boggling how they could, learn the language in, like in a space of weeks, or a few months. It was amazing. I mean, basically they came here to work. I think their goal was basically, find a place to work temporarily so that they could send, money back to their families in their home countries, and they had the hope of eventually returning home. And they adapted really well. They learned the language. They didn't close themselves. They didn't close themselves in their little communities. I mean, they mingled with the Portuguese. They made friends among the Portuguese. And I think overall, there was just a very positive impression with those waves of.
And I imagine some of them decided to stay there.
Yeah. There's a lot of them as well that decided to stay and start their families, and even their kids, even sometimes they even outperform Portuguese kids in like grammar or something. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's always positive to hear, I guess, successful immigration. I wish hear more of that in other countries.
I'd say that the secret to that is basically, as an immigrant, you have to like really commit yourself to adjust to your new environment, to your new reality. Like learn the language, mingle with the locals. I mean, I suppose like the worst thing that an immigrant can do, like if he seeks to adapt, is to just stay in his little group. Like if he stays within the community, I mean, there's a lot more to be gained in terms of adaptation. I mean, if you just mingle with the locals, if you make friends with them.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is what I talked about in one of my earlier videos. in case my father, but actually the other half of my family, half is Hungarian, originally came from Ukraine and then emigrated in the beginning of the 20th century to New York. And yeah, I mean, it was always the same principle, you know. If you just, you know, stayed in your own Ukrainian or Russian community, then
you would stagnate.
And so you had to kind of adapt. But increasingly, there's this attitude that you know, you as an immigrant, you just, you know, they accept weird expectations. I mean, it's not universally true, but it's often the case. And I think a lot of people. See, my position is pretty simple. I don't have a problem with immigration per se, as long as it's controlled and selective. In the case, and I keep on talking about this, it's hard not to, but in the case of Germany, they've literally decided to let in 1 million refugees every year for the next couple of years. I mean, that's not sustainable. It's not controllable, more importantly, and there's just no way that's going to work out long term. And I plan on making a separate video on that. But I think the Ukrainian-Russian success story in Portugal can serve as an example. Furthermore, I would imagine there weren't millions of them just flooding into the country.
No, but it was still. I mean, it wasn't all at once, but it was. We can say that thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: thousands even is different.
But then again,
from
like
millions.
they had to. I mean, basically, they were forced to sort of like lower their. I don't know, expectations maybe, because like there were many cases of, for instance, Ukrainian immigrants that were back home. They were professors. They had like master's degrees or something, and then they ended up working in construction or like janitorial jobs. So yeah, it's like. Basically, they had to sort of like start anew in the country, all their previous accomplishments.
And that's often the case, and I think that's gonna. One of the major issues with the mass immigration in Germany is, well, one thing.
I'd say that the problem with that is that there isn't. There isn't an infrastructure prepared, like in terms of homes.
You can't millions of people.
No, but in terms of homes, jobs, I mean.
Well, that's the other problem, and I plan obviously in talking about.
I don't know how the hell you can get.
Here's the issue, and I don't want to talk too much about Germany because I want to do some separate coverage of that. But here's the thing: is that for one thing, 1% of the population for 3 years, we're talking about 3 million people. By the time they're integrated, you know, that's going to take years. There are language barriers. Okay, that can take a long time. Sometimes it never happens. And there are other things. People want to bring their family members over, you know, more welfare. And you know, the one of the elephants in the room is Islam. Now, the Ukrainians heading over to Portugal were not Muslims. No.
Well, yeah, no.
So you know, this is, you know, we can't keep on sweeping this under the carpet and saying that, you know, all immigrants are the same and they all come with the same qualifications. And look. It would have to be much smaller numbers. I don't have an issue with immigration per se, but you know, it's just the numbers and the fact that, you know, culturally, we've already experienced some of these difficulties. You know, mingling with people who just come from a totally different background and aren't eager to integrate with. The modern world as we live in Europe. And I think that's the difference. I mean, if anyone can look at this as an example, I mean, the Ukrainian integration in Portugal, which I've read about, you know, does seem to be a pretty big success. I've even read instances where you had, you know, people that were doctors and they were, because they adapted so quickly, were able to, you know, practice medicine in Portugal.
Oh, yeah, there were some cases of that, as well.
I just don't foresee this.
But that was the thing, you know, they basically learned the language really quick. They had to integrate because a lot of them were coming alone, and that forces you really to create, you know, bonds with the locals too.
And you weren't giving them freebies. You weren't like, come here and, you know, get this and
especially,
get shelter.
Especially because we're just not in an economic situation that allows, you know, just giving stuff away. I mean,
I think the worst thing that happened with Germany was a combination of wealth, generosity. I mean, there are other issues, and the fact that, you know, it's been a disaster.
You cannot avoid the fact that Germany lives with that perpetual guilt of Nazis.
Well, yeah, and I want to talk a lot more. I don't want to talk too much about Germany, but I did want to mention this very interesting section of recent Portuguese history where you had a pretty big immigration from Ukraine. And Ukraine is a shithole. It always has been. That's why my family left there 100 years ago, and my mother's side of the family, and I guess that's probably why they left, 10 years ago.
No, I don't know. I don't know how now there's the war and all going on, but back then
Ukraine has been a shithole for a long time.
But back then their economy was not stellar.
It's never been a good place to really hang out, or if you want to enjoy life. It's cold. Russia's always had an influence, and I think if history's a judge, Ukrainians tend to leave and get better options in other places like Portugal or the United States. But talking about then modern Portugal, so how would you say the politics lean overall? Because we talked about Salazar and the dictatorship.
I think maybe because of Salazar, because his politics were so conservative and really hardcore right wing, connected to the more traditional rights, religion, all that. We see a lot of left leaning parties. It's basically, I'd say probably we have like a proportion of five left wing parties for each right wing party, something like that. That kind of reflects even in the current government that was elected just last year. Which is a parliamentary coalition of left-wing parties, and that was a very shady situation, because what happened was that the coalition, the right-wing coalition, PSD, CDS-PP, won the elections, but it didn't get a majority, a parliamentary majority. So what happened is that three left-wing parties, the Socialist Party, the PS, and the PCP, the Portuguese Communist Party, and the Bloco de Esquerda, which is like another far left left-wing party, they united after the elections to vote the government out and to make themselves a parliamentary government. And it's like that created a lot of unease within the society, because there's you got the people on one hand that hated the right-wing government, because they had to impose, they were forced to impose all those harsh measures, to tackle our debt and the crisis. And then there's the people on the right side of the political spectrum that feel, it was like a coup d'état, that was sort of like an illegal maneuver that, that the party that didn't win the elections became government. So there's people on one hand saying that they're not legitimate. On the other hand, they're saying, okay, yeah, but the rules say that, whoever has parliamentary majority is the government. And I don't know. Myself, I'm kind of on the outside of all this, because I really didn't vote for each one of them. I don't know. I feel that neither political sides has the right approach for coming out of the economic crisis. But nonetheless, I feel that it was a very shady move. And as a result of that, you have their first policies, of the new government was just basically to undo everything that the previous government had done. Even some outrageous cases, like the new catcalling law that was.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about that.
But actually, funnily enough, that was implemented by the right-wing coalition.
Well, if they're traditionalists, that shouldn't surprise anyone.
There's I even wrote an article about it on shedding of the ego about the topic. So to those interested.
So I mean, why don't you tell us a little bit? I mean, we can go on. I guess it's sort of MGTOW related, but it's fine. I mean, what's going on with this catcalling law in Portugal?
Well, it's basically it's being considered like sexual harassment. It's catcalling, like whistling.
Is catcalling a frequent thing?
I mean, it's sort of like the thing that you like expect, like from construction workers. Like you have the traditional case of like the construction worker on the scaffolding, whistling to women passing in the street or something like that. But it's like. It's silly because it's a harmless thing. I mean, and now they're seeking to punish it with prison because women feel molested by.
Well, this is an interesting question, though. I mean,
in
Latin American culture, you have this thing called machismo, right?
Yeah.
So, do you have something similar like that in Portugal?
Yeah, it's like it's this like very traditional, traditional male thing, like you're expected to be this macho that picks up a bunch of women, like a major Mac Daddy player, whatever. Yeah. So.
But I mean, how powerful must the influence of, say, feminism be to get an actual law passed like that where it becomes illegal?
Yeah. Well, in a sense. Feminism, but I'd say maybe I think what Barbarossa once referred to as trad feminism.
Yeah, trad feminism, which is kind of the same thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I even referred that on the piece that I've wrote for Shedding of the Ego, where a parliament member for the right wing party, the PSD, they convinced she convinced her male counterparts to approve this law by putting the problem to them in the following way. It's like, picture if this was your daughter. Like, imagine if this happened to your daughter. If some random guy, some creepy old man, said that like he wanted to fuck her or whatever, and I assume that really sparked within their sort of like traditional protector-provider role that really sparked, made a flame. It's like, oh no, this could happen to my daughter. I must protect her from this like vicious old man, and this lecherous old man.
Well, actually, a lot of the similar reactions to what happened to the sexual I guess harassment thing that went on in Germany. A lot of the reaction against it has been based on, we need to protect our women.
From those dangerous men coming to...
From the other, it's always like that. It's basically one tribe of men, whether it's religious or racial or whatever, it's always like, we need to protect our women from these other men.
Yeah.
And a lot of the opposition to the immigration...
And you see that even that same perspective is used on people that oppose migrants coming to Portugal. There's also that talking point. Oh no, they're coming to rape our women. They're like
my opposition to mass immigration is basically two things. It's the economic consequences and the cultural problems with Islam. I don't give a shit about the women, to be honest.
Yeah.
But most of the inspiration for opposition does come from, our women are being affected and blah 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 blah, and I think you're going to see this current everywhere, pretty much.
It's the point where it starts to become like a problem to be addressed, because otherwise people are just going to keep sweeping problems under the rug until it affects women somehow.
Yeah, I mean, there was even one guy on YouTube. He took the video down. He's a white supremacist or something.
I saw it on Barbarossa's site. Yeah,
lives in the States. I don't know why he's talking about. We need to protect our European women. Like, what the?
Yeah.
No, and this is the problem I see. At least it's not just about Germany. I think in general, you're kind of stuck in the middle. I don't really like these populist parties. I certainly don't like the far left. I'm anything but that. And I'm not my objection to this mass immigration is based on pragmatic and practical things, mostly economic and the cultural problems of Islam or political problems of Islam. So but I don't care about they're taking our women and all that shit. And so, but that's the problem. You're kind of stuck with one or the other. And I think all these countries have kind of divided along two sort of sides or two lines, and you're kind of you're not left with a really good choice. I haven't heard, maybe I'm not paying attention enough, at least in Germany, I haven't heard a politician talk too much about the economic problems and other things, and and a lot of these grassroots things. There's a group that sprung up in Germany. Now they're everywhere. Basically they're called the European Patriots Against the Islamification of the Occident. Yeah. And I on one issue against the Islamification, I can get behind them, but everything else is just crap. They tend to be ultra nationalists. They tend to be legitimate racists. Yeah. They tend. It's just like, I don't want to. I have no interest in aligning myself with that. And I think this is just this is the problem that we're going to continue seeing. And I think Portugal proves, for example, that you don't need leftist feminism necessarily to impose. If it's true what you're saying, you can just get sort of trad.
But slowly but surely, it's gaining a foothold. Because
basically
it. We're catching up with the times. It's like
lucky you.
We usually say in Portugal that we're like 20 years behind, like the U.S. or Europe or something like that. So basically, maybe the situation that exists in the U.S. Nowadays, society-wise, maybe could happen in 20 years in Portugal. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's some truth to that. It's just a matter of time. But I think I get anything else you'd like to add before we draw this to a close. By the way, would you like to talk about salted cod?
It's good. You should try it. If you haven't tried salted cod, you should. There's 1,000 recipes for it.
Yeah. See, my problem with smoked fish, it's not really a problem. I like smoked fish, is that when I think of smoked fish, I just think boring. It's like, I might buy some, smoked mackerel or whatever, and it's good for like a meal, but it's not something I want to eat all the time. It tends to be pretty bland. Are you telling me that, the Portuguese have magic that creates
yes. And the secret is keep it simple. It's just usually like a bit of garlic, olive oil, parsley, and some potatoes. There it is. You got magic on a plate. But I'd say the best thing is cured meats. That's smoked cured meats, and basically a lot of the fantastic food is basically comes from the need to preserve food before refrigeration, like salted cod. They have to salt the cod, for it to survive the trip from the North Sea all the way up here. Or there's the case of port wine. Port wine came to be because the English, when they were shipping red wine to England, they mixed it with brandy so that it wouldn't spoil during the voyage. So, and that's where port wine comes from. It's that fortified wine. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, probably could have an entire week's discussion on Portuguese cuisine, but I did want to keep this relatively simple. Now, so everyone, hopefully that was interesting. This is my first time handling these kinds of topics, a bit different than some of the conventional stuff, but I think it's, in fact of the matter is, the MGTOW community, mostly Anglo-Saxon, but as you can see with our friend here, Golden Eagle, he's Portuguese, he's not Anglo-Saxon, although obviously his English is exceptional. It's often the case with the Portuguese. But, I think it's interesting, especially given the climate, that we take the opportunity to explore different countries. And I have some other people lined up, hopefully, to talk about countries as diverse as Canada, Nigeria, the Netherlands, of course, Germany, and some others. And, and I'm probably going to, if I can, talk to multiple people. So I don't necessarily want to just talk to people who agree with me. if we go to the United States, and I think that'll happen for sure, maybe we can get Lord Hornbuckle on. He is an avowed communist, and we can talk about the evils of capitalism. So, we'll see. But I hope that was interesting. At the very least, you had a little bit more about Portugal and what have you. And anything you'd like to say as we finish up?
Well, I don't know. Nothing really. Just take care, everyone.
Yeah, and I'll be linking to Golden Eagle's channel in the low bar. Okay, so everyone, thanks for listening, and we will check you out later. And once again, the series is called Perspectives, and we're focusing on different countries. So take care.
Bye bye.